Welcome to Globespan. I'm Paul Nehru, Tennessee of Guyana, a voice for independent thought and action. Today we have an extremely interesting subject. We are going to discuss two questions. What are the problems between the governments in Guyana, not only the current government, but even previous governments, and civil society organizations, which are also known as NGOs? And we also are going to discuss how we can identify some concrete recommendations to improve the relations between civil society organizations, NGOs, and the government, the current government, with a view that they both could contribute to democracy, deepening democracy, social justice, and the vital interests of Guyana. And we have with us today an eminent group who will be sharing their views with us, and we'll be having a great discussion. We have with us Mr. Timothy Jonas, who is a regular on this program with me. He's the chair of ANOG and he's a senior counsel. And we have with us Dr. Desmond Thomas, who has been here before and he's a coordinator of electoral reform group. He's an author, he's an economist. And we have also with us Dr. Mahadeo, who is known by a lot of people, both inside and outside Guyana, as a popular talk show host, particularly during the 2022 elections. He's an expert on finance, but he also is linked with an NGO, nonprofit group called Article 30. So, gentlemen, welcome to the program. And I'll start immediately with our illustrious Timothy Jonas, attorney at law. Timothy, how do you define a civil society organization, NGO, number one? And number two, do you view being in Guyana right now and what you're following in the society, that there are problems between the government and civil society?
It's an interesting question, Paul. Civil society, good evening, first of all. Good to be back. I haven't been on this show in a couple of weeks. It's nice to see you, and I look forward to an interesting chat. I haven't been on the show with Doc in many a moon. It's good to see him, and I think this might be my first time with Yog. I'm sure this will be interesting. I liked your topic, Paul, because we use the expression civil society, and we're all familiar with the expression, but we don't really try to identify what exactly it means. Civil society, generally speaking, means us, all of us folk who are not in government, who have whatever endeavor in the society, whether it's professional or business or anything. But when you take that totality, it's unwieldy. So you have to identify points of communication. And the representatives of civil society are the only points of reference that we can use as far as I can see. So you got to look at your trade unions, your churches, your masjids, your temples, private sector commission, chambers of commerce. And those are the groups which have been formed, which represent this broad, vague concept that we call civil society. As soon as you start doing that, looking at your trade unions and your churches and the religious groups and the various professional groups, the interest groups, the lobby groups, I think that's where we run into problems. You see, government, of course, is supposed to represent society. Society votes for the government. But can we identify where the opinions and views of all of us are fairly and proportionately represented and expressed by any of these bodies, whether it's a trade union, whether it's a commission? And I think that's where the question really needs to be. What is our civil society? Where can we identify it so that we can have an engagement with it?
Okay. And do you think there is a problem currently in Guyana between civil society organizations and the government, from what you've been reading in the newspapers or your contact with the society?
I think the problem we have is that not one of those groups that I've mentioned whether it's the religious group or the professional group or any lobby group, is fairly representative of our society. Each of those groups, whether we're talking about the Public Service Union or the Agriculture Union, each of those groups clearly and with very few exceptions internally represents either one or the other of the two large ethnic-based parties. So each group, whether you're talking about private sector commission, chamber of commerce, church, temple, masjid, if you go into it and speak to the individuals in each of the groups, you will see almost without exception that only one of the two large ethnic parties is represented in each of those groups.
Very, very interesting. Dr. Thomas, the same question to you, my brother. What are the problems between government and civil society, and what kind of concrete recommendations you could have for improving that? Now, I noticed your group met the Attorney General, right? So it would be very interesting. You've been having some kind of dialogue.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me, Paul, and I'm happy to be here with my colleagues, Timothy and Yog. I think Timothy really started on the right, in the right direction by trying to identify or define what we mean by civil society. And essentially, it is groups of people who are not part of the government, non-governmental, mainly non-governmental agencies. But to a certain extent, it helps us to think not just about a definition that's based on the groups, but in a sense, we should define civil society partly by what they do. What's the purpose? What's their role? And this is really important. Civil society plays an important part in societies. They give voice to different sections of the community. They advocate for things. Guyana doesn't have a lot of very strong civil society voices, apart from, say, the trade unions and so on. And most of these, you don't really have much of a voice anyway. But you do hear, when I think of civil society in a way, I think of somebody like a woman, Eileen Cox, who used to be that consumer. I don't know if you remember her. Yeah. She used to be like the one voice for consumers in this country. So you get a sense that there is civil society, and there have been real champions of civil society, but they're isolated and pretty much on their own, So to a certain extent, if we talk about civil society, we have to talk about what they do and how well they're doing it. Are they advocating for a group and so on? There will always be problems. Now, we have, is there a problem between government and civil society? That's a big question. I think it has to do with the way politics works in this country. I mean, that sense of accommodation is not part of our political culture. Government is there pretty much, governments pretty much ignore, as far as I can see, seem to ignore any kind of civil society voice, and that's partly the fault of civil society. Civil society isn't making enough noise around things. So those are my kind of initial responses. Essentially, that civil society is, plays this important role in society. It's associated with democracy. A society with a vibrant civil society element would tend to be a more vibrant democracy. And just before I finish, let me just say this one thing. Civil society is really important in Guyana, and I hope we get a discussion of that, because we have a very polarized political environment. And the only way around that polarized political environment is civil society, is some group that comes in between, that has the conscience, so to speak, of the population, and is able, therefore, to influence the conventions and the norms and the values in the society.
Thank you
So
very much.
we have a lot to talk about, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, you keep coming on. You could say as much as you want in the program. That's why we have it. Dr. Yog, it's so wonderful. You had me on your program, and it's such a pleasure now to have yours. And it was great being in Guyana and having a chance to have a very good conversation with you. I wish you'd come to America very often so we could have chats. I love chatting with you. Dr. Yog, the same question to you. Your Article 13, the group in which you're very involved, I've been following it, and you've been in the media to some extent, a bit controversial too. How would you define civil society, non-governmental organizations? And do you think there is a problem in general today in Guyana between civil society organization, NGOs, and the current government?
Thank you, Paul. Good night, one and all. And let me say hello to everybody. I haven't been here for a long time. Hello, Tim, and all of you. And also, let me say hello to my wife and children. They're also seeing this coming back together on Globespan. Good to be here. And Paul, to refer to the question, I think Tim and both Tim and my brother Desmond answered it well. I just want to lean into what they said and what you asked. The definition, I think from Canada, we would read that one of the definitions of civil society would be that it referred to the activity of citizens, organizations acting in free association without the authority of the state and without the motive of profit. Has to be very distinct, Paul. You see, when you have a stake in the game, how free will you be? And that is something that we also need to explore. Nowadays, everybody would examine any civil society organization by the focal point of how does it serve their political party's interest. If you're not serving the interest of PPP, PNC, then you are bad for Guyana. 2 or 3 years ago, when I was on the same program and talking against APNO AFC, when you were not serving APNO AFC, you were bad for Guyana. The evaluation of civil society and their function, unfortunately, in many people's eyes, hinges upon their loyalty to a political party. Whether there is a problem with government or not, to me, is not as important, because if there is a problem with government and civil society, it means you're being active. You're having an impact. But you see, Paul, we must assess a couple of things. One, the role that we have to play without having a stake in the game. I don't have a constituency, you don't, but we want to ensure that we can continue to represent the interests of the people who are speaking with us and who look up to us to represent their interests. Dr. Thomas speaks about constitutional reform. Timothy Jonas speaks about constitutional reform. How will it get done? It will not be done by the people who have much to gain without the kind of reforms we're talking about. This is where civil society becomes important. Final point I'll make on this very quickly. The same evaluation, the same criteria that people would be beating up you and I for being in civil society. When we were speaking out, the 6 months of election impasse, without civil society, where would we have been? It was civil society. It was like Room 592 and Globespan and all these groups that came together. There were groups operating, Timothy knows of some of them, operating behind the scenes that pushed for certain things to happen, that liaised with the diplomatic community, that liaised with the State Department. It was civil society. Yeah, one of the ministers said all we did was make some noise. But you know what? Without that little noise, we might not have been where we are today. Hats off to the civil society groups that spoke out then and continue to speak out now. But I see, coming back to your point, I don't see a conflict between government and civil society. I see that there are always going to be points of engagement and disengagement, which is healthy. Where there is a problem is when state assets and state resources will be used to kill independent voice, to attack people and their families, and to start to destroy independent media because you have state money to open a barrage of media houses against them. That is even more the argument for an even greater and better active civil society. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is extremely interesting. At the end of the program, we'll do a poll. Devin, do you have the questions for the poll? Can you put it up so that our panelists could have a look at it? Devin? Devin, are you there?
Yes, I'll put it up in a moment.
Okay, thank you. And to our viewers, these questions would be put to you, and we'd like to get a response because we want this program to be participative. We want you to participate and see your thinking. And little by little, we want to make the program much, much more dynamic, where you could even call in and we could have chats with the guests who we bring to the program. I do this program once a month as a public service to Guyana. I'm an independent thinker, and I always have been and always will be. I do believe you don't even have to be in a civil society organization to enjoy the rights, responsibilities, and duties of being a citizen. As long as you're a citizen of Guyana, you have the right to speak freely, move freely, associate with who you want freely, and to express yourself without the state or anybody else trying to curtail your rights. So that is a God-given right. Nobody in Guyana or outside of Guyana, and wherever I am, in any country of the world, I take the same position. So it's not just in Guyana, but even here in America, I express my views in the classroom, outside of the classroom, and in civil society organizations. Devin, do you have the questions up?
Yes, we are posting them one at a time for the viewers.
Oh, but what about the panelists? Can they have a look at it or not?
Yes, well, one of them is up right now, and we'll keep pushing all of them throughout.
I don't know if they could see it, but anyhow, can you read it for us then, Devin, so they could know what it is?
Sure. So the first question is, do you know of any NGO civil society in Guyana? The second question is, should the government have regular meetings to dialogue with the NGO civil society in Guyana? The third question is, should the civil society organization take concrete policy proposals to meetings with the government? And the last question is, should civil society organizations be absolutely independent of political parties and governments?
Okay, so this is a new development where we are trying to get the audience to give a view of what you guys are expressing and so forth. So along the same lines, I come from the labor movement since I'm 21 years old. And you know, we have a big problem with that in Guyana because GAU was with the PPP, TUC with the PNC. Even when I led a movement, Democratic Labor Movement, we had the National Workers Unions. The leadership of the union was the leadership of the political party, like Mahadeo Pandey's UNC and all Trinidad Sugar and General Workers, and the whole of the Eastern Caribbean and many of the Caribbean countries, because we were influenced by the Labour Party of Britain, where they had the Labour Party and the TUC, and they had a very close relations. I know about the problems that entails. It's a serious problem. And one of the questions, let's start with labor unions. Do you guys believe that trade unions should be absolutely independent of governments, whichever government is in office? And then we will go to civil side. Tim, what's your view? Tim?
It's not possible in Guyana to try to claim complete independence. I actually don't think our trade unions would survive on their own unless they were propped up a bit by the legislative and government arms. I can use the Public Service Union as an example. When you take on employment in the public service, they don't even ask you if you will make contributions to the union. They automatically make your deductions from your salary. It goes to the union. If you specifically say you don't want to be in the union, there's some fee that they deduct because they say you get a benefit from
You're a free rider.
union
You're a free
activities for
rider.
others. So if you take those things away, and I actually have reservations about the legality of those things, and you say to your average employee, look, we got this union, would you like to join the union? If you do, you got to pay $2,000 a month. I rather suspect most people would say no. And if you ask most ordinary employees, I'm not talking about the noisy ones, I'm talking about the ordinary folk that go to work every day, go home, look after their families. What has your union done for you? I think most Guyanese would have a hard time giving you an account of what their union has done for you. And I know a lot of people wouldn't be happy to hear me say that, but you got 7% last November, 7% salary increase. What has your union done for you in the face of 25, 30, 40% inflation in the same period of time, in the face of, oil and gas windfall? So I don't think the unions would survive on their own, because the bargaining power is not there, and the employers would find it quite easy to bypass them and interface directly with the employees. I don't think that historically in Guyana, the unions can say that, at least in the last 20, 25 years, that they've done a great deal. A lot of them, their leadership has been installed and permanent, immovable. And I don't think that a lot of those leaders motivate and inspire their members. So if you try to divorce the union from the government support, you may kill the union. And yet, as you say, each union is clearly identified along a government line. GAU is PPP, Public Service is PNC. It's clear as day. So how do you divorce the union from the political landscape? I don't know. That relationship is harmful, but I don't think that in Guyana the unions can survive without that legislative and government support.
Dr. Thomas, what's your view on this?
Well, I think you started out by making the kind of historic connection between unions and the political sphere. When we think of it, most of the leaders, the original leaders in the kind of pre-independence, independence struggle, so to speak, had some kind of union connection. And to a certain extent, it's not just a matter of the unions depending on say the government. To a certain extent, it's the other way around, politically, where the unions have been a basis for mobilizing for political purpose. So, as you know, Jamaica, the parties, the big parties, both had union. Manly was the National Workers Union, or what it was. Bustamante, of course, they have a union named after Bustamante, and it goes like that throughout the Caribbean. The Birds, of course, here in Guyana, the Chedi Jagan and Burnham had union connections at some point. So there has always been some kind of relationship between the unions and the political parties. Now, but the real question, the key question is how they perform, how they function in relation to the political parties. And I think that, I don't see a problem. I mean, we can't do anything about the unions being related to political parties. But the unions, since they have independent strength, they bring strength to the parties, right? They bring numbers and they bring resources as well, right? Since they do that, then maybe the union leaders can exercise independent power, can be a voice for their let's say, take for example GAU. I mean, it's quite possible that rather than being an instrument of a party, GAU can probably bring pressure to the party, to the whole political sphere, based on the desires and the needs of its membership. So I think, to kind of summarize that, we cannot, the parties and the unions have some connection. That's historic. However, we and the members of the unions need to be able to bring some kind of pressure, use the strength that they have within the unions in a constructive way to influence, because they have influence. That's the important thing. The unions have numbers, they have resources, they have influence. The question is, how do they use it? The problem in Guyana is the way polarization works. The country is so polarized that ability and that potential that the unions have to make an impact, a positive impact, that is where things go wrong. If you know that a certain union, you can predict the actions of a certain union at all times based on its political connection, that's a problem. And we ought to be able to demand of our unions, the members ought to be able to demand of their unions that they at least show some kind of strength in the interests of the workers.
Dr. Yo, what's your view? And the reason why I start with the labor unions, because they're the oldest kind of NGOs that are there, and evidently they have, unlike advocacy NGOs and service NGOs, they have a membership base where they get an income. So, Dr. Yo, what's your view, first of all, with the trade unions and governments? How do you view that relationship?
Well, I agree with what both Timothy and Dr. Thomas said. Historically, this has been a marriage throughout Guyana's history that there will be no likely divorce anytime soon. It is something that is part of our lifestyle, our livelihood as Guyanese. What gets me, Timothy mentioned something that I want to go back to. In the Burnham regime, there was collective labor bargaining was something that was out of the windows, out of the doors. Burnham would come on television, those days radio, and he would say, I hereby announce a 5% or a 7% increase for all public servants. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, what has changed? And who has caused it to get back to those days when public servants' increase can become a part of a state's decision? And what happens to collective labor bargaining? However, the problem is not with the government. I very much question the labor unions themselves. In many ways, the unions have become so lazy because they have gotten used to being fattened by workers' union dues that nothing has been done for years representing union unless and until there is a government for them to oppose. So when the PPP is in government, certain unions are going to speak out and become very, very active. And similarly, when APNU is in government. One would have found, though, that throughout the history, you would have found that even to their credit, the PPP has even had problems with GAU. That is, GAU has remained proactive regardless of who is in government, at least to a degree. But I very much question what the trade union movement is doing for the labor across Guyana, more than just verbiage. We have seen, we all know world leaders that travel business class. They have the fancy rides. They go all across the world. On whose money? It's on the workers' union dues. It is time that workers take back control of their unions. It is time that the workers realize their future lies in their own hands and not people who sit in an office for 40, 50 years. And especially, I will support a government that says if you can't have your audited books, something is wrong. I would support a public call for all trade union movements to be audited and to comply, like any other organization have to comply with the laws of this country.
Well, Dr. Yog, each year, all union books are you're supposed to submit to the authorities in Guyana, your records. I remember our union had a free of charge the services of Christopher Ram. He did our books for us of the union. But as a historian, when I look at Guyanese history, I like to explain it in three processes: conflict, convergence, and cooptation. In the early days with Critchlow and Ayubidon and these guys, it was very conflicted. We started off with a leader emerging at the head of the crowd. And then the British got smart and they wanted stability, so they legislated labor laws. Labor laws allowed control because you have to work within the law to negotiate, to sit at the table, collective agreement, ways in which you could call a strike and so forth. And then the middle class appeared, the Jagans, the Burnhams, the Jainarain Singhs, and etc., etc. And they appeared and they were forming political parties. But they need a political base because adult suffrage was on the number one on their agenda. Each person could vote in Guyana, so they needed the masses. So they made a strategic alliance with the unions. And so I call that convergence, the party structure with the union. But then one of the parties would come to power and they will co-opt that union. And then Mr. Burnham or whoever there, Mr. Jagan, they will say, well, look, when the British were there, you had an enemy, a common enemy. You had but your own government is there now. You can't be using the same tactics. That's a little bit of history about union party-state relations. And I remember, I did a lot of work helping to fund the Patriotic Coalition for Democracy to fight for free and fair elections. Then one day, Dr. Jagan asked me if I could stay by. He wants to talk to me about something with Rupert Rupnarain. So I said, what's up, Doc? He said, Paul, if you don't, the National Workers Union do not stop organizing in the plantation, the PPP will walk out of the PCD. And Dr. Rupert Rupnarain, who had absolutely no base in the sugar belt, opening his mouth and said, that is the position of the WPA. So there are some good experiences and bad experiences in union party-state relations across the Caribbean, across the world. But this is an interesting subject, and somehow the labor unions have got to find some kind of way in which, or the workers themselves will have to find some kind of way in which they could have their vital interests be represented, independent of governments and political. It always comes down to money again. It's always about money. Now, we speak about the unions and the parties. Now, what about civil societies, NGOs? We have them into two big categories: the service ones, like food banks and that sort of thing. And then we have the NGOs that are doing advocacy. Tell the audience a bit what's the difference between the two, and Dr. Yog and Dr. Thomas, tell us a bit with your organizations. Where do they fit? And where do you get your money from? And how do you intend to get money? And how the NGOs in Guyana can get money so that they could be independent of the government and the political parties. Let's start with Dr. Yog.
Well, Paul, I'll tell you something that always makes me smile when I remember the days when I was a young man and had basket on my head to walk the streets to sell greens and vegetables to get help with home economics and stuff like that. And you move up, you move on in life, and you get to a stage where you want to make certain things happen in society. You put your hand in your pockets, you ask your friends, you ask your neighbors, and you make things happen. And by and large, those civil society organizations that want to remain independent, there's no way you'll get funding from anyone. You will do as much as you can do with the resources that you can manage to create. If not, then you are going to just flounder without any finances. And that's a fact. And that is not a bad thing. You see, Paul, when I started, I spoke to constituency. I spoke to one having a ball in the game, so to speak. If you don't have a stake, I don't want to have a political position. I don't want to have, and I've heard all of these rumors about being offered this and being, no, I have not asked and I don't want. There are some of us that have been asked to appear on parties' political lists and we turned it down. And we turned it down because we wanted to remain independent. The point though, Paul, is that civil society, as long as you're going to remain proactive, you are going to run the risk of becoming hated by persons whose agenda you won't agree with. But at the same time, all of those who see what you're saying and hear what you're doing, and of course see what you're doing, hear what you're saying, they would know what you're saying has truth to it. And that's all that matters, truth. Look, there are people in government, and I'm hoping at one conversation we can come to this, when you talk about constitutional reform with the two gentlemen here who are fighting for it. There are people in government that occupy the 99% of the seats in parliament that will never want constitutional reform to the extent that is needed to really transform Guyana. And their loyalists are going to say, well, if you want to change it, go contest the election. Contesting the election is a different matter, right? Contesting the election is a very different matter in which you are empowered to get certain things done that we the people, as contained in the Constitution, is represented. Now, coming back to your point, civil society can only be as active as we want it to be when we allow our voice of reason to prevail and not just base your judgment on a party position, because you're always going to go against one or the other. Two, with funding. There are very few groups, and I don't disagree with those who say that, there's a lot of noise out there, Paul, that there are some groups that were horribly silent during the 6 months of the election impasse. And I agree. If you were silent then, when the most heinous things were taking place in Guyana, how can you speak now? But that should not blind us to realities that is taking place as well. We should not use that measuring stick to blind us, because I tell you what, if we continue to say that if you are silent during the 6 months, you should be silent now, it means you will say 150,000 to 200,000 people in this country will have no right because they voted for APNU and they backed APNU regardless of the rig. So we have to be careful, and it is only civil society that can have certain things done and said. Last example I'll make, so I spoke about I hope I'm answering your question. I spoke about the funding. Civil society groups, if you want to be civil society, be registered and be audited. Put yourself out there with integrity and express and be open for anything. People have asked, where are your books, who are your members? Come and see. Ask at the right time, or ask me personally and you can know. There is no secret with at least our civil group. Paul, I'll ask you a question. There are certain members of government and certain members of the opposition, current government, and previous opposition, previous government, that they all agreed on certain things. But they changed their mouths, they changed their words when they got into power. And that is on oil, the largest steal that is taking place in this country. And without civil society, who would be speaking out?
Okay. This question of funding is very important. Now, I want to ask a question to all three of you. Anybody could answer, because we're all adults in this program. Do you have any objections for civil society organizations to link with international or global civil society organization and receive funding and technical assistance from them? Yes or no? Desmond, you start.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me come to that question. But
Desmond,
because
before you continue, Desmond.
yeah, what I wanted to say is kind of following up on Yog. To a large extent, the civil society has to take responsibility for itself. Has to take responsibility. Because the cause is important. It's not a matter of the government or somebody letting you. People have to stand up and make their voices heard, and people have to organize and make their voices heard. And in that sense, an important thing is this: civil society is non-governmental, but not non-political. If you are involved in civil society, you have a role to play in the political life of the country, and that's really important. You speak out, for what is going on, and in a way, you have elections every 5 years or whatever. Civil society is really important between the elections, during the 5 years, not at the election time. But so your voice has to be heard at all times. That's the important thing. And so the whole business of raising funds and all that is your responsibility. Now, I could tell you, first of all, I agree with the idea that if you have a civil society, you have to go through all of the procedures to make sure that you're financially transparent. But in addition to that, and a lot of civil society groups have problems raising funds.
Yeah, well, you have to answer the question, but when I come back, the question
about
whether civil society organization in Guyana should be allowed to take money from international civil society organization. But we'll come back to it. Let's have the break now, and then we'll come back. So, Timothy, my question is, should civil society organizations, NGOs, take technical and financial assistance from international NGOs that share with them common objectives and common purposes? And common
I frankly, I see no reason why not. But it varies. It depends on the civil society group. It depends on their objectives. It depends on the activities they're in. I mean, you can't have. There's no one answer to that question, Paul. You can't have one answer for all civil society groups. All right.
Well, in principle, do you agree that they can or should not?
I don't know. They can depending on.
It has a big problem with that, and a lot of the autocracies in the world have a big problem with that. So anyhow, Tim, what's your view on that? About if you have an NGO in Guyana and like in human rights or whatever it is that they are involved in, can they link with international organizations and receive technical and financial assistance? Is that a bad thing?
That's absolutely right. That's nobody's business but theirs. Good. If they can find somebody who will sponsor them, who will fund them, and they're not compromising on a moral or ethical position in terms of the delivery of the service they want to deliver, that's nobody's business but theirs.
Yeah. Very good, very good. That's clear. Dr. Yoga, what's your position on
just let me, if I may, just interrupt for a moment. Give an example. You take a civil society group that's involved in the environment. The environment the environment of Guyana cannot be separated from the environment of the world or the Caribbean or elsewhere. So if you are in an environmental, a climatic type of NGO, then you have almost an obligation to link with other NGOs, similar, and you're involved in a global struggle, right?
Wonderful.
So that is why I say
Point made.
it
Point
all
made.
depends on
Point
what
made.
you're doing.
Point made. Point made. Dr. Yog, what's your view on this?
Well, Timothy is right. Dr. Thomas is right. Depends on the civil society organizations, but you know it's their business. However, I want to throw a caveat in here. Many times, it is a local organization that will have to pay upwards to become members, right? However, Ghanis, we all need to know some other stuff. Look, there is green scamming or greenwashing. Greenwash is the new term, right? Where organizations are created. Let's take the environment, Paul. So there are organizations being created to justify, created and funded by world type organizations, funded to run their green scamming. Now, it comes down to the bottom line of disclosing, being transparent yourself, disclosing, having your books audited, disclosing to the authorities or following the statute, ensuring your audit and so forth. But I want to tell you something else. The trade unions themselves have been in receipt of monies, right? Aid and financing from international labor organizations. And I don't know that the audits were done and they were very transparent. I'm not accusing them. I'm saying that there's a question that can be asked. And two, political parties are in absolute breach of a requirement in ROPA for them to even declare election expenses, where they got the money from. Not necessarily in those words, but for them to declare the election expenses. So you know, we can talk about civil society organizations, yes, and I agree. Yeah, they have every right to run their affairs as they so choose. But at the end of the day, the laws of this country must be followed by all, regardless of what type of organization you are, governmental, non-governmental, whatever it is. You have to be audited. You have to declare your source of funds. You have to disclose your finances.
Okay. We're going to talk a bit about recommendations, and I have one that I'll put out to you all and we could discuss it. But based on my experience, I was in the leadership of the Confederation of Latin American Workers. We had unions from Mexico to Chile. And I also was General Secretary of the Caribbean Workers Council, where I administered a program in 25 unions in the Caribbean, and Deputy Director of the Caribbean Institute of Social Formation, which did an educational program throughout the 25 islands. The office was based in Curacao. Now, where did we get finance from? Now, we have sister unions. I personally, the National Workers Union in Guyana, we got help from Acticom, which is a Dutch Christian union, and they have a foundation, and they give us contributions for the educational programs we had. We also got support from the Christian unions in Belgium. They also give us projects, like, for example, sewing machines. We got a boat and an engine for an Amerindian brother who was in the interior, and so forth. So, and we also had educational programs. And then we had support from the Adenauer Foundation. Now, I want to explain this because it's very interesting, and it comes to a proposal I'd like to make to civil society about funding, because I believe if you guys don't have independent funding, you're not going to be able to really develop a kind of independent relationship with governments. Now, what Germany did was this. They said if a political party gets into office in Germany, they can establish a foundation, and the money, a percentage of the money that Germany will give for aid will go for that foundation, and that foundation can support parallel ideological organizations across the world. So you all know that both Germany and Japan were constrained from having a foreign policy that was independent and a military and so forth. So in Germany, you had the Christian Democratic Party had the Adenauer Foundation, the Social Democrats had the Franklin Network Foundation, and then when the Environmental Party came, they had the Green Foundation. Now, all those monies in Holland, in Belgium, and in the Bundestag in Germany were declared their public records in the parliaments of those countries. So I think that money is clean. It's not money the way you could say, well, you with a KGB or the CIA and so forth. And Dr. Yoga is right. All political parties, including my party, was affiliated to one of the three main international political organizations, PPP to the Communist International, and they got a lot of financial and other support. The DLM, my movement, we were affiliated to the Christian Democrats. We didn't get a lot, but we did get some. And you also had the WPA, Socialist International. Well, they moved from revolutionary socialist to socialism. I don't know if they got any help. But anyhow, the point is that everybody was linked internationally. Now, my recommendation, one of the things that we did in the CLAT, the Confederation of Latin American Workers, is that we needed to get some kind of independent finance. So what we established was a foundation. All the unions from Mexico to Chile came about, and we had a foundation called ILACDE. And all unions will submit projects to the ILACDE, and the ILACDE will have a staff, and they will help to get these projects in good shape, and they will go abroad and wherever and make representation to get funding. Now, I think in Guyana, if the civil society organizations can unite and get together and set up a foundation so that they could help the small NGO, the medium NGO, and the large NGO by providing them with the kind of technical services and to help them to approach, because some NGOs in Guyana have more experience than others on how to get financing. And one of the problems is a lot of jealousy among the NGOs, because in 2005, I did a study for Action Aid International on the causes of poverty in Guyana, and I interviewed almost every single NGO in Guyana. So I know the kind of problems that they face and the kind of difficulties. What do you guys think about that idea? A foundation put together by all civil society organizations so that you could have a common pool to get finances and technical assistance so that you really can be independent and autonomous. Anybody?
Well, it will be fraught with problems. You have NGOs, I spoke of this earlier, the green scamming, the greenwashing that goes on. You have NGOs that have political agenda. Dr. Thomas spoke about it. Nothing wrong with that. They have a particular core interest that is towards a particular agenda. Can you stop them from being an NGO? No. So how are you going to draw them from a central kind of funding when the core or the focus points would be very, very different? And then you have NGOs and civil society groups that are just totally there to help people, help the poor, help the sick, help the needy.
Service organization.
Yeah. So the variables are too many. I would want to think that it is something that can be explored, but whether there could be such a formation of something, I don't know.
Okay, so let's move to the other part now. Is there any concrete recommendations on how we can improve the relation between government in Guyana today and NGOs, civil society organizations? Evidently, from the media, what we read, there is some degree of conflict, some degree of confrontation, not physically, but some degree of confrontation. Is there a way we could establish some kind of framework? Is there any initiative that civil society could take to do this? Or is there any plea or proposal that we could make to the government that they should take, and that it is in the interest? Guyana has to deepen our democratic process. We have to institutionalize a liberal democratic system. It's very clear. And since political independence, when we reached by 1992, the McIntyre report said we are at the status of Haiti. And from 1992 to now, all we have achieved is that we are the third poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So it is very important in a polarizing world of which Guyana is a part, as a polarizing society, that we sort of break this polarization. And I think the beginning could be a relationship between civil society and government. So what initiative can be taken by civil society and what initiative can be taken by the government? What you all will recommend to either civil society or the government? Timothy, what's your take on that?
Gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to forgive me because my answer is going to be lengthy. Paul, we started out by saying we have to define civil society. And although we have pointed out that there really is no single entity that represents civil society because every single entity in Guyana is totally politically aligned, your question goes back to the assumption that there is a single entity called civil society that can be fostered and encouraged into a relationship with the government. But so far, we still have not identified any institution which represents civil society. So to answer your question, if you want to talk about the relationship between government and civil society, the relationship between the government and the pro-PPP organizations is wonderful. Just like 5 years ago, the relationship between the PNC government and the pro-PNC civil organizations was wonderful. ACDA had a wonderful time 5 years ago. Now the government is putting up pictures showing ministers going and talk to the people and talking about how it's including civil society in the process, and the Natural Resources Fund has one member who is appointed by the Private Sector Commission. And I see now there's another piece of legislation being proposed where the committee again has an appointee by the Private Sector Commission. And that is being touted by the present government as representing meaningful efforts by the government to reach into, quote, civil society and involve, quote, civil society in the process. But if you look at who the Private Sector Commission comprises, Paul Chung, I think he was actually on the PPP list of candidates. Ramesh Duku, I believe at some point he was on the PPP list of candidates. Komal Singh, Mani Ram Prasad, Ryan Alexander. Now, some of these are good people. Ryan Alexander, I've had words with, and I believe he is a good, honest, hardworking citizen. But he's a pro-PPP man. So when we say, here's the Private Sector Commission, and here is the government making an effort to reach into, quote, civil society by reaching out to the private sector, they're reaching out to a subset of the PPP. So we are camouflaging reality by giving labels and fancying the thing up. But at the end of the day, the institution is easily recognized. The Public Service Union is pro-APNU. The GAWU is pro-PPP. The Private Sector Commission, the Chamber of Commerce, is pro-PPP. So don't let us pretend that any of these organizations singly represents, quote, civil society, because our civil society comprises equal numbers of a highly polarized point of view politically. In fact, I would put forward that if you needed to find a real civil society that is not tainted by polarization one way or another, you got to go and find a third party, because it's only those third parties, previously AFC, now Anog and Schumann and those people, whose constituents represent civil society that is not already classified and labeled and allocated irretrievably, possibly, to one of the two extremes, meaning that they already are not civil society because they are already polarized and harnessed to their respective masters.
Dr. Yoga, what's your take on it?
Paul, look, Tim has answered it well. There is nothing much one could add to the whole dimension. I want to throw this into the mix. Many times people see civil society as being anti-government or against a political party. I know, for example, we and the work we do and the articles we produce and stuff like that, it is not aimed at belittling the government. It is not aimed at attacking the government. Look, if Article 13 didn't call on the government to put to follow the Constitution and put the Public Procurement Commission in place, who else would have called? It is civil society. It is with an aim to help develop, maintain, sustain good governance in Guyana. We can see something from our perspective. The government and the opposition are going to see something from their perspective. Together, we can make it work. Nobody is anybody's enemy. We don't profess to become anybody's enemy. And I don't think anybody here on this panel wants to be an enemy to anyone. So our objective is to ensure that we can point such things out that the rest of the society wishes to be in place, that we all want to be in place, and that the government might be having an oversight, that might be probably just not looking at it from that angle. When we represented, for example, that you tell me what is wrong for us calling for civil society to call for constitutional reform. What is so wrong when we were all voices against the election rigging? Everybody was happy. Now, I remain one of the only voices consistently calling for an independent review, a public inquiry into GCOM post-2020 elections. Is the same format of the same GCOM that will be going into the next election. What will stop it from doing the same kind of nonsense again? You see, and I'm not blaming the government. The government has its agenda to manage the business of running Guyana. It is our job to help them in that process to ensure that they keep sight of some of the things they promised. If we don't have the right to vote and our vote to be counted, because one or two persons in GCOM decide they want to interpret or vote in a particular way, then what else do we have? And who else can speak out than civil society? So the role of civil society is extremely important. It is not one that must seek for political office. Very quickly you hear people say, go run for, it is not one that seeks. So if you want to be political office, go and contest the election. It is one that seeks to help the politicians of all sides of the divide to make Guyana a better place. Last thing I'll say, it is civil society that has reminded the politicians on both sides of the divide, well, on the three sides of the divide, that you know what, you have a Chief Justice that is acting. Council Jonas will correct me, but we had Justice Chang. He retired acting. We had Justice Carl Singh. Justice Singh retired while acting. These men have served more than a decade in the space. And in the independence of the judiciary, Paul, you don't want to have people acting in these positions. It doesn't speak well. And guess what? We spoke out. Everybody spoke out. But when the chairman of the CCJ came to Guyana to speak out, then it takes a different tone. But nobody attacked the chairman of the CCJ for saying the same thing.
That's very interesting. Desmond, you want to make a comment, it seems.
Yes. You know, I think we you know, we're really getting to the meat of the problem now. You know, maybe it's going to be kind of defined what we mean by civil society, but really we have to look at what's happening in this country. How this thing called civil society, you know, what's happening, does it matter, and so on. And the fundamental problem is the polarized political environment, which means that is, in the end, the thing that we need to work towards changing. And civil society is critical to that effort. Critical to that effort. But the other thing is that the thing that we have to guard against is being too pessimistic to getting to the point of feeling nothing can change in this country. We're locked into this polarization. And I would challenge the group by saying this. The four of us, if anybody asks us where we stand, can we be non-political, non-partisan, whether we have, everybody is entitled to a partisan preference, but can we act in a non-partisan way? I'm sure all four of us would agree that we can. So we have to ask ourselves, if how is it that the four people in the country who can do that just happen to be here tonight? We have to get away from this idea that things are locked in such a way and nothing can change. There are lots of people out there. We know that there are parties and partisan people and partisanship and polarization, but there are lots of people out there who want the same things that we want. And the important thing is, how do we mobilize that set of people? How do we reach a point where those people get a voice, right? And get their voice out there. There are lots of people who want better. And they may be even in the political parties. They may be even in the same the trade unions and so on. The point about it is, how do we break? And this can only be done by an active civil society. Now, the reality is civil society is not very well organized, or people say so anyway, right? But I don't think that it is hopeless. I think that, and that's why the efforts of little groups, the Article 13, the Electoral Reform Group, and the other groups of that kind, and even some of them that we don't even talk about much, right? Even maybe small groups in a church or a temple or whatever, right? The efforts that we are making then becomes really important, because it's just a matter of how do we find a way to reach those people who are minded in the same way. There are other people who may be sitting on the fence, so to speak, and need the support, need the guidance. And that is what we have to do. Civil society has to keep speaking out, has to take responsibility. Now, that connects with your question about funding. One of the challenges is how to finance, how to garner the resources to really achieve these ends. And it's going to call for resources. I mean, as Jörg mentioned, each one of us, if you're active, you put your resources out there, you make your efforts, you do your best. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to really make a change, it does call for support, the support of the wider community. And we have to find ways to deal with that. All right? But the challenge is, one, not to give up hope. Believe in Guyanese people. Believe that there are people out there who want the change that we want. The problem is the electoral system and the political system, because listen, the government can consult with you and I. They will consult. But at the end of the day, they can go to Parliament and do exactly what they want, irrespective of what the consultation. And that is as a result of the political system that we have. That has to change. All right? Because otherwise, the consultation becomes farcical. It's very interesting. I should say, I'm an optimist, and part of the reason for that is this. Right now, the government has called a consultation before they call a consultation before the budget. They've called a consultation on the ROPA. They had some kind of consultation around
Explain to the audience what is ROPA.
The representation of the people at the government is proposing to amend the Representation of the People Act,
Good.
which governs the elections,
Wonderful.
right? And they put out some amendments and they made it public and they asked people to respond and so on. The reality is the consultation, as far as I'm concerned, has been weak. One of the problems is that the government tends to not favor groups that are going to be critical, and that's one thing, the cultural things that has to change in this country. I've seen it in other parts of the Caribbean where people engage people who have an opposite opinion. Not here. In this country, if there's any suspicion that you're going to be critical, they don't want to hear from you. They disenfranchise you, discredit you, who voted for you, etc., etc. All right? So these are the things that have to change. Civil society has to raise its voice so that the conventions and the norms become are changed, because a lot of what's normal in this country is abnormal. All right, so that's what that's where I would say civil society just has to make its voice heard, because in a sense civil society has to save this country. And there are people out there who want to be part of it, who want to contribute. Some of them secretly, they may come like Nicodemus in the night. They may not want to show their faces. But the important thing is for civil society to be able to stand up and make its voice heard, and try to break the polarization. Just as one thing.
Why not now?
Yeah, one quick thing. Yog mentioned the GCOM. I mean, GCOM is obviously, dysfunctional. GCOM in its present form cannot work, and we know that because we've seen what has happened over the years. The whole the formula is wrong, cannot work, and yet both parties hang on to GCOM in its present form. So that is the kind of thing where civil society and many groups in this country, I'm sure, can see the value of coming together to work on something like that. The oil business is another one. There are many things.
Come back to oil again, because that is another story we'll get to.
There's a bit of a disconnect going on here. Yeah, and I wonder if I could address it. You see, Yog started out, and Desmond
we got a couple of minutes more, so you guys got to be sharp, and focused.
With a premise that I absolutely agree with. The premise is that in our system, once government controls parliament, then you can't change the rules because they control parliament. The second premise is the government, and that's whichever government it is, PNC or PPP, once they are in government, they like the situation and therefore have no motivation, no inclination to change anything. Therefore, you cannot have constitutional reform because that needs 2/3 and the government will not agree. And you cannot even have legislative reform as long as the government has the majority, because the government will not agree and will keep pushing through legislation that centralizes power to the few in the government, such as Natural Resources Fund. So that's the starting point and that's the premise. And what I don't understand and don't agree with, I'm afraid, is the jump that Desmond then makes to say, so civil society must be more vocal. Because in Guyana, the voters will vote how they are voting. And you could be vocal. We're a noisy culture. We make as much noise as we want. 5 years ago, the Rastafarian community said, you got to legalize marijuana. They're right, you got to legalize marijuana. I agree with them. I told them I agree with them. I agree with them now. And you know what? The government, the PNC government, refused to do anything meaningful to legalize marijuana. And that same Rastafarian community went and voted PNC strong to a man. Right now, the Trinidadians are in the country, and the Chamber of Commerce is saying to its president, Your Excellency, we don't want you to sign any deal with these Trinis because they got tariffs that are unfair. The president can say to the Chamber of Commerce, go to hell, and he can sign anything he wants with the Trinis. And those same Georgetown Chamber of Commerce people will go and vote PPP at the next elections. The two parties are not answerable to their constituencies because those constituencies will vote for them anyway. And this is why I respectfully got to say that I don't agree with what Desmond is saying about civil society making noise, hoping to persuade the powers that be to change. They won't change. What civil society, and by this I mean the neutral people, need to do is recognize the failings and the inherent harmfulness of both parties, because that can be the starting point. If you seek to engage and dialogue and persuade either of the two large parties, you will fall like AFC fell. You will be subsumed and consumed because neither of the two parties wants change. Both of the parties like the status quo because they enjoy it so much when they're in power, taking money, being corrupt, enjoying the good life. And therefore, there is no motivation for them to change. And the small, weak voice on the outside trying to get that change is not going to work.
We're running out of time, and that's a great political perspective. And we've had some good civil society perspectives. As I made the recommendation, let me finish a bit. We are coming to the end of the program. As I made a recommendation about funding, I still think if that recommendation cannot hold, we still have to try and see how civil society can have independent funding and support, because without that, they can't be independent and do their thing. Here in America, the ruling class, one section supports one set of civil society organization, and another set of part of the ruling class that have money support another set. In Guyana, unfortunately, private sector does not do that. They are wary of advocacy groups. They see them as political groups. They are more sympathetic, perhaps, to do a donation for service groups. But I believe advocacy groups are as important. And this is another advice I'd like to throw out there. And that is, if you're being accused that you don't have a base, the only thing a politician understands is if you have a base. Now, you could call it a social base, a political base, a cultural base, a religious base. Let me give you an example. Cheddi Jagan was a diehard Marxist-Leninist linked to the apron string of the Soviet Union. And he repeated that propaganda day and night. But you know who he had in the leadership of his party? Ripu Daman Prasad, the leader of the Hindu community. He was playing politics. Very clear, because he thought Ripu had a base. Civil society organizations, I advocate, should begin to have assemblies and convoke the people that support their independent way of thinking and the interest groups' objectives that they are pursuing, and continue to demonstrate in the society. It's not 1, 2, or 3 people who are talking, and you build it little by little. You may get 100 people the first time, 150 the next time, and it grows. And in that way, I think that's the way they do it in Latin America, and very often here too, and even get elected to your position within the civil society. Now, we've run out of a bit of time. This is a very, very interesting discussion, not only for Guyana, but in the Caribbean, Latin America, and across the world, and even here in America, also and in Europe. But right now, my friend Devin has a poll for us. Devin, what is your report?
Sure. So the first question again was, do you know any NGO civil societies in Guyana? 50% said yes and 50% said no. The second question was, should the government have regular meetings to dialogue with the NGO civil society in Guyana? 70% said yes and 30% said no. The third question, should the NGO civil society organization take concrete policy proposals to meetings with the government? 76% said yes and 24% said no. And the last question was, should NGOs, civil society organizations, be absolutely independent of political parties and governments? 76% said yes, and 24% said no. Again, this poll was conducted by the viewers who are on tonight.
Wonderful, wonderful.
How
Thank
many
you very much.
viewers?
You shouldn't have asked that question. It's secret. But anyhow, it's okay. You could check afterwards and see on the website, and you will.
Yeah, but Paul, just let me respond to
Remember, I don't
Timothy's point
control the time. You have
very
5
quickly.
minutes to tie this program
Very
up.
quickly.
And I have to go to Baltimore to visit my
Yeah,
son and grandson.
cool.
Okay.
But I take the point that the politicians will not willingly give the changes that we're talking about. But as an optimist, I can look within the last few years, we've already made a fair amount of progress, I think. And you take the little victories and build on them, and hopefully you move things. The fact of the matter is that we are now in a position where the major political parties are starting to admit that we need electoral reform. They're starting but undoubtedly, their idea of what is the electoral reform that's required may not be ours. But this is a positive. It's a change. It is a little victory. And the thing about it is that's the only thing we have. Now, I know that Tim, is favors maybe the kind of third party angle, and I have no problem with that. The fact of the matter is we don't have to do this approach. It's not either or, because if civil society is vocal and pushing, it helps other strategies to work. So I really believe that I agree with the challenges that Timothy is pointing to, the political challenge, but I really think that we should not give up, that little changes are happening. And then a final point is the point that you just made, Paul. Civil society has to have a political base. I mean, the thing about it is that the trade unions have a political base already.
Dr. Thomas, Dr. Thomas, you're strategically getting into an error. Do not call it a political base. You're not a political party. Let Tim do that.
No, you don't have to be a political
You call it a
party.
social base. Social base.
Okay, if you want.
Anyhow, we have come to the conclusion of this program, and I have made 3 very good friends tonight, and I look forward to you guys coming back to this program. This is the second program I'm doing on civil society and government relations, and they're going to be a third program, and I will bring up 4 grassroots women to speak about their work in a civil society. They just came back from Ecuador, where they're from the Amerindian community, and they're doing a number of projects. Now, I believe also, like when I was a student at university in Canada, I used to write these critical essays about the vulnerability of Guyana, the Caribbean, and Latin America. But in the end, I said, we have to intervene and do something about it. So Desmond, I'm with all 4 of you in your different perspectives, 3 of you, that we have to keep hope alive. And last but not least, go back to my historian hat. Throughout the history of Guyana and the world, there are 5 ways in which people react to oppression or restraining of their rights. They either escape, they either run away, they either get co-opted, they either adapt. Sometimes they commit suicide, but there's always a small group. It's never a big mass group, a small group that keep the light of freedom going. Our struggle in Guyana throughout, in conquest, indentureship, slavery, 20th century colonialism, and post-colonialism, has been the quest for freedom. Without freedom, civil society, political parties, and so forth cannot function. So we got to keep the light of freedom going. And I see you guys as guys who are keeping the light of freedom. So keep on doing the good work. God bless you all. I'll see you the next time. I'm Paul, Nehru, Tennessee for Globespan.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Paul.
Paul.